Hello and welcome back to another edition of Civil Discussion on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, March 9th. Also a great pleasure to be here with my co-host, Don Keelan, who's no stranger to GNAT-TV. Don, good to have you back here. Good to be back in the studio again.
Thank you very much.
So anyway, without any further ado, I want to turn the microphone over to Mr. Keelan here, who's going to introduce our guest.
Our guest today, and a very special guest, as Andrew has said, is Governor Jim Douglas. Governor, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, fellas. Thanks for having me.
And those who are not familiar with the governor, which I can't believe there are any out there in our viewing land, let me just say that in 2011, the governor stepped out of office as the governor, where he had served for 8 years, having become governor in 2003. And prior to that, Jim was the Secretary of State for Vermont. He was also the Treasurer of the state of Vermont, and has served a number of years in the legislature. And if I'm not mistaken, you were one of the youngest legislators when you took off your cap and gown from Middlebury College.
Well, I went immediately, almost a few months after graduation, to the legislature. But interestingly, Don, that year, 1973, we had the largest number of legislators aged 25 and under in the country. I was 21, but there were 3 members younger than I. So we had some youth.
You were you were just about at the age you could get a drink up in Montpelier. And today, the governor, together with his bride, Dorothy, still reside in the Middlebury, Vermont area, where the governor is a professor at the Middlebury College. And you're still doing agricultural work, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? You still have a farm up there, right?
We have some land that we lease to a farmer. I'm not going to pretend that I'm active anymore.
Oh, here I was going to ask you for some eggs, but Governor, welcome to the show. And you heard Andrew mention that we're trying to create an atmosphere of civil discourse and how to get the mechanics into play that we can get more civil discourse in so many areas. But let me just ask you a question. And I want to go back now to your book that you published in 2012, The Douglas Years. And you write, and I quote, "A governor sets an example and leads through every debate, no matter how contentious. I sought to uphold the Vermont tradition of dignified civil discourse." I was wondering, how are you able to do this, and why is this not the case today?
Well, I remember during that first year in the legislature, nearly a half century ago, when all the new legislators from both houses were brought together to hear a lecture from a senator named Graham Newell. He was a professor at Linden State College and served in the Vermont Senate for many years. And I still today remember the advice he gave us, which was, it's okay to attack an idea, but not the person who offers it. And I tried to remember that during my time in state government, and remember that other people are coming from a different perspective, a different experience, a different point of view, but they were chosen by their constituents to serve. And I always assumed that they were acting in a way that they believed was the best interest of their district and state. So I thought it was important not to personalize it. In fact, the rules of the legislature specifically prohibit personalizing debate. So I tried to keep it focused on issues and not individuals. And I try not to be shrill. I think we all know about some people in public office who are overly aggressive in their rhetoric. And I tried, like Governor Scott, to hold back and be respectful of other points of view and listen. And as you indicated in your introduction, not necessarily change my mind, but at least understand where the other person was coming from. And as a practical matter, in Montpelier, today's adversary on a particular issue might be tomorrow's colleague and supporter. So it's important not to burn bridges, because coalitions come and go, and you may need to work with that person on the next issue that comes along.
Well, but why is not the case today? And let me move it out of the legislature, maybe in other areas throughout. And I'm just trying to stay with Vermont, if you will.
Well, I think social media have really exacerbated this. I feel lucky in a way that I left office when I did. In my last campaign in 2008, I had my one and only Facebook page, and it was relatively new, even though it was only 14 years ago. And now, of course, everybody is on social media and tweeting and sending commentary on just about everything and everybody. And it's pretty easy to hide behind a keyboard or a touchpad. And the lack of personalization of our discourse, I think, has made it edgier and less collegial. I also think that folks in politics have become more polarized. There are a lot of studies by political scientists that show that the American people are actually not. Most Americans are fairly centrist. There are certainly those on either end of the spectrum who are more enthusiastic. But folks in public office seem to be more partisan than they were. When I first went to Montpelier, I don't recall very many party line issues. There were different coalitions, urban versus rural, or the Connecticut River Valley, which was always concerned about sales taxes, versus other parts of the state, agriculture versus industry, but not R versus D. And now when I look at the votes in the legislature, especially in the House, they're more party line. So I don't know why that's happened, other than the fact that we're not perhaps as special as we used to be. We're more like the rest of the country. But in the end, we get what we choose. And I think the people of Vermont have to hold their public officials accountable and demand more civility.
May I just follow up with one point there? Could it be, Governor, that today's members are loyal to their leader and not to the cause, and therefore the leader or the leaders are telling the body, this is the way we want you to go, as opposed to when you started, you had more individualism?
Yes, I think that's clearly true. We see it dramatically in Washington, where everybody seems to get in line. And the reason is they have a lot of power over the members of their caucus. They just decide how much money is allocated in the next campaign cycle, and they demand loyalty in exchange for that. The leaders in Montpelier don't have the same amount of power. I remember when I was the House Republican leader, there wasn't much I could do other than use my powers of persuasion to try to get my members of the caucus to vote a certain way. But even then, when Peanut Kennedy was Speaker my first term, I can remember just once he came into a caucus and sort of laid down the law on an issue, just once out of an entire biennium. So there's certainly more allegiance to party now, and I don't think that's really in the public interest.
Well, just to sort of build on the point you were discussing here with Don, what's been interesting to me as I thought about all of this over the last year was to go back and try to figure out what the origins were of how we went from being a society and a government. I suppose that's the easiest way to look at it. I mean, I, at the risk of looking at the past through rose-colored glasses and thinking how everything was so much better back in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, when things seemed pretty complicated enough and often very, kind of edgy. It seemed like, there was a sense that, to look at on the national level, which is kind of where I'm going with this question, Republicans and Democrats could, knock each other over the head with one rhetorical device or another over the course of the day, but at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, they could still sit down and, have a beverage and talk about their grandchildren and kind of just be normal people. And I don't get the impression, and I could be wrong because I haven't been to Washington in a while, that that's not the way it works anymore. That's what I keep on hearing, is that there is a much more bitter and almost personal divide between left and right, Republican and Democrat. And I guess I just wondered, my theory on what one of the origins is that the globalization that occurred in the economics of this country and the world had a big part to play in that, and an unintended consequence of factories closing here, moving their plants to other countries, and leaving behind, communities that had been reliant on a couple of factories for their jobs and the workforce and the economic vitality of those communities, and all of a sudden they were left with nothing. And that planted the seeds of a lot of bitterness. And I think we've seen that in a couple of the last presidential elections, that this sort of feeling of grievance really coming to the fore. And that, of course, was just amplified even further, I think, in 2008, 2009, when the recession hit, and we had another round of people losing their homes, mortgages, their jobs, etc. And I'm sure as governor, you remember that period extremely well and had to make a lot of hard choices and decisions to navigate through that. But I guess I just wondered, does that make sense? That that's really kind of where this all began, or is there some other route that you think of?
Well, I think that has exacerbated it, Andrew. That's a good point. I mean, in the end, people are most concerned about their own economic well-being, that of their families. They want to feel secure, have a place to live, have a decent job, and be able to educate their kids, take a vacation once in a while. And when the economy went south, that made that less possible for a lot of Americans. And it's easy to take it out on the politicians, particularly those who were in office at the time. But I don't know that that's the entirety of it, because we've had other recessions. We had a depression. And I'm not sure that things were as bad post-depression as they seem to be now. I think your assessment is accurate. There are 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Bob Dole, Howard Baker, Tom Daschle, and George Mitchell, 2 of each party, who about a dozen years ago were concerned enough about the deterioration of the institution that they served and loved to form a think tank called the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington. The 2 Republicans, of course, have since died, but the BPC continues to work to bring people together to talk through issues, to find common ground. And I've been involved in some of their projects over the last decade. I don't want to tell you that we've solved this, but we at least have found in policy ways places where people can come together. Olympia Snowe, a former senator from Maine, wrote a memoir a few years ago, and she said we have to get back to a time when compromise is not only accepted, but valued. And I think of Bob Dole, one of the founders of BPC, who said, I never compromised my principles, but I did compromise my positions. And I think that's what we want of a public official, to hold firm to the basic values that he or she holds, but to find that elusive common ground and work across the aisle. Just one thought on on why that we're where we are. It used to be, I'm not sure when it ended, that members of Congress were more likely to live in Washington, D.C. and bring their families up there. The legislative week was longer, and it made more sense to have the family base there. Well, now, as you know, they go down Tuesday morning, they come back Thursday afternoon. Senator McConnell has called some votes late Monday, so he's stretched the week just a little, but they're more likely to live in their home districts or states. And in the days when they were in Washington more, they would get on a train with their entire families, go up to rural Pennsylvania, spend the weekend playing softball, having barbecues, and getting to know one another. And now they don't. In fact, Congressman Welch has told me that he doesn't even know every other Democrat in the U.S. House. He knows the ones who are on his committees, but he doesn't interact with them. So we got to get them to develop those personal relationships. And Senator King of Maine had an interesting idea probably too practical to be accepted by his colleagues. But he said we should change the schedule so that we come here for 3 solid weeks, including weekends, and then go back to our districts for a week. So we are forced to spend time with our colleagues. Well, it hasn't happened.
If I can join in and follow up on Andrew's point, you recall, Governor, way back when, in my other life, I spent quite a bit of time with Eisenhower at Camp David in the summer White House when I was in the Marine Guard.
Yep.
And many times on weekends, the president would be at Camp David with people from the other party to work out things. He would have at the summer White House, which was up in Newport, for 6 weeks. He would bring up people from the other side. And when the interstate highway system got built, which is after Eisenhower's time in a way, and the jet travel, many people in Congress felt, I can get home for the weekend.
Right.
And I tell you, when I'm here in Vermont and I see our 3 legislators, there are 2 senators and the rep here in Vermont, I know, it's nice to see them and all that. But I'm saying to myself, if you were down in Washington meeting with the other side, we may be able to get things done a little bit more than what's been happening now. But there was more, as Andrew says. You went out at night, and I saw them walking around in the opposition. I was a young Marine, and I didn't think much of it at the time. But I look back on it, and I'm talking about now when Kennedy and Williams and Senator Dirksen and Senator Taft were all coming up to Camp David, and that was a special place. And
well, you're still a young Marine, Don.
no,
But
thank you very much.
but I might extrapolate your thought to here in Vermont. And you mentioned the interstate highway system. I half jokingly have suggested that it was a big mistake to build them because more state legislators now commute than did in the older days. I mean, you can be in St. Albans in under an hour on a good day from Montpelier on I-89. And I remember Dick Snelling, with whom I worked when he was majority leader and I was his assistant. And he would go to his office at his manufacturing company in the morning for a little while and breeze in just before the gavel fell at 9:30 or 10 o'clock. And it's hard to build those relationships with so many commuters. So I agree with your point, both in Washington and Montpelier. We just don't build the relationships the way that we did.
So that leads me to a follow-up question to my first one, which is, and you've sort of already addressed this, but what's the pathway out of it? I mean, is it simply a case of, restructure the schedule so that they spend 3 weeks together in Washington and then a week home, or force them to go out to the the bar for a drink or two at 5 o'clock and kind of, I promise to think, okay, you can say X, Y, and Z has happened over the past 30 or 40 years, and that's how we've gotten from, some kind of, more bipartisan place in the past to here.
Well, let me follow up with that. When you were governor, did you stay in Montpelier overnight?
No, usually not. Once in a while, but generally not, Don.
You went home, right?
I did.
Home was in Middlebury?
Correct.
Okay,
correct.
So you were not there at night. So it's long gone. But to go out and have this beer that Andrew talked about with the legislators.
Correct. But when I was in the legislature, I did stay overnight. And I felt that was important, not only as I started when I was single, but even when I got married in my second term, I felt it was important to have that time with my colleagues. And so generally we would spontaneously gather at what's now called the Capitol Plaza Hotel for dinner. Very often there were committee meetings or hearings or entertainment in the evening that we all attended. Every Wednesday night, as you may know, is called Farmers Night, where there's some entertainment that's organized by a committee of legislators. So when I was in the House, I did spend nights in Montpelier, and I think that was an important part of working together. But how do we get out of it? I really think building those relationships is key. Don, you mentioned President Eisenhower's practice. Before there was a Camp David, President Coolidge in his autobiography talks about inviting legislators of both parties over to the White House for griddle cakes and Vermont maple syrup. He probably listened a lot more than he talked, but he got them together, and I think we need to find ways to do that. Now, there is a group in Washington that Peter Welch has been a part of, bipartisan group that gets together for dinner once in a while, but we don't seem to have enough of that, at least to build the kind of lasting relationships that are important.
Could I follow up on that with I want to go back to your book again, the Douglas years, and you mentioned, and I quote, by the end of the 2009 session, the legislature decided to go its own way in its budget. I vetoed the spending measure and was overridden, resulting in more than $20 million in new taxes. My question is, why were you unable to engage the legislature and get them to, and resolve this without having to go to that extreme?
Well, I don't know. I told Governor Scott recently that I'm happy to have turned over to him the record for the most vetoes in history. Actually, Governor Dean had the record, but I had the record of the most overridden vetoes. But when there's a legislature of one party, especially with veto-proof majorities, they can have their way on any given day. And in 2009, they did, and they have a number of times during the current administration too. I felt very strongly that we were on a path to unsustainable spending, and we needed to make some choices that they were unable to do or unwilling to do. So we weren't able to resolve that, but in more cases than not, we were, because compared to other states, we don't have a lot of vetoes and veto fights. One interesting follow-up on that, though, Don, I announced in August of 2009, after the session was over, that I wasn't going to run the following year. And I was unsure about how that would play out. Would I become a lame duck and they would run over me even more? Or would I remove the target? And so they wouldn't have any reason to be difficult and partisan. And to a degree, it was the latter in my final year in 2010. So I don't know if that's an argument for term limits, but at least in my final year, when I wasn't running and they didn't have a reason to be difficult, we seemed to get along better.
Governor, before we have to run, there's one other question I wanted to throw your way. Kind of a different area than, let's say, government, and that's colleges. Colleges are kind of also a place where civil discourse seems to be a hard thing to find in the kind of quantity some of us like to remember from the misty past. It seems that I've been reading a lot about issues where issues of academic freedom have been kind of challenged, and somebody says something that's slightly unorthodox in one way or another on either side, and the next thing you know, there's a Twitter landslide descending on them. What is your sense of that? Is that something that's just sort of overhyped in the media, or is it actually going on? And to what extent can that experience teach us something about the need for civil discourse?
I think the situation on many college campuses is very problematic right now, and I include Middlebury in that group. I mentioned the Bipartisan Policy Center, and my most recent project with BPC was to co-chair last year a task force on campus-free expression, coincidentally. Those who are interested can go to bipartisanpolicy.org and find the link to that report. we identified a number of serious problems. One is cancellation of guest speakers, and Middlebury's had experience with that recently. Another is academic freedom, where some professors have been pressured into not pursuing certain avenues of inquiry that they were interested in. Self-cancellation by students who feel uncomfortable expressing their views because they're out of sync with the political orthodoxy of the institution. And I think it's important for colleges to be more inclusive, more tolerant. The problem is a lot of our campuses have become monolithic in terms of their ideology, and we have to find a way for them to reform. So sorry we're running short on time, Andrew. That's a topic all unto itself, but it's a serious one, and I think we need to do better there.
That's something we could talk about for 30 minutes just by itself.
And I think we should one day.
Well,
I'd like to have an invite, Governor, to cover that one. That's an outstanding one, because one thing we have in Vermont, we have a lot of colleges too.
Yeah. Well, the good news is there are some places where good things are happening. I met a number of college presidents over the last year in the course of this task force's work. And for example, Ron Crutcher, who just retired as president of the University of Richmond, is Black and was besieged with calls to take a name off a building on his campus that was in honor of someone who was a slave owner. This is in, obviously, the Old South. And he refused. He said, we're not going to cancel this gentleman. We're not going to erase history. We're going to contextualize it. We're going to learn from it. We're going to expand on it. And so the solution in that particular case was to add the name of a slave. So instead of the Jones building, it's now the Jones Smith building or whatever. And contrast that with Middlebury, that has removed the name of one of my predecessors, Governor Meade, from the chapel that he paid for over a century ago because of allegations of racism and involvement in eugenics that I believe are drastically overblown. So there are good examples out there, and we need to spread them around and get more colleges to follow them.
Right. Have you been able to get Middlebury to change their mind, or has the chapel been renamed?
It has no name right now, and they're planning to appoint a task force to come up with a name, or perhaps recommend that it just be called the Chapel, kind of like the Washington football team, I guess. So I don't know what the future holds. I've had several meetings with college administrators, and I'm not getting anywhere. But there are some descendants of the governor who are quite upset, and may decide to speak up for themselves soon.
Well, unfortunately, Governor, we're going to have to leave it there for today. But as John is saying, we could easily have another half an hour long discussion on these and probably a whole range of other topics. And I'll save the further 4,999 questions for that time. But I just wanted to thank you very much for making the time for this conversation. I really appreciate you carving the time out of a busy schedule for us. And we'll look forward to seeing you again for perhaps the 20th time. With
Governor, it's not stalking by any means, but you're just a wonderful guest.
Well, it's great to see you guys, if only in two dimensions, and great to be with you on the show. Thanks for having me.
We'll look forward to the in-person time, the next. All right. Well, great. Thanks again, Governor. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you who've been with us today, and hope you found our program interesting. And we'll hope to see you again the next time. For now, Andrew McKeever for GNAT-TV.
Thank you all very much.
We'll see you again. Take care.